Hello and welcome to the Stinking Albatross Podcast. My name is Alissa Golob and I'm here with my co-host. I almost just said Aaron. That's my husband. Scott Hayward. Aaron's my co-host in life. You're my co-host in the podcast. So welcome, Scott.
Yeah, we are not married.
You're my work husband, basically.
Yeah. Got to file for divorce on that one.
Today's episode is brought to you by Larosse Media. They make professional videos to fit any budget. So next time you need a commercial, promo, or corporate video, think Larosse. Check them out at larossemedia.com. So we're going to skip weekend updates. We're going to skip everything because we have a big podcast today. The leadership race happened on Saturday. The results were announced. We're going to talk to Andrew Lawton about that a little bit later on in the podcast, get his thoughts. But let's just do a quick recap on what happened for those of you who missed it, the numbers, the breakdown, what it means. So basically, Pierre Bonnard won in the first round. He won 68% on the first ballot. He won 330 out of 338 ridings, which is just crazy. Jean Charest won the other 8, all in Quebec. Charest won 16%, Lewis 9%, Baber 5%, and Aitchison 1%. So yeah, not even close second place with Charest there. And yeah, he then shortly after he announced his House leadership team, which was also interesting, notably because Scheer was his campaign chair in Saskatchewan. Pierre actually received 7 endorsements from MPs in Saskatchewan. Leslyn Lewis had the other 3, and he won about 78% on the first ballot in Saskatchewan. And last leadership race, correct me if I'm wrong, Scott, but Leslyn won in Saskatchewan.
That's right. She got the highest number of votes in Saskatchewan and the highest number of points.
Yeah. So, I mean, just a big victory there for Pierre. Not super surprising per se, just judging from the number of people who attended his events. I mean, I even tried to go to an event in Calgary and couldn't even get off the highway because it was so backed up. So that was the general roundup of what happened on Saturday. And just a little bit of background of who Pierre was, or who Pierre is. He's not dead. He, his whole life has mostly been in politics. He was adopted by 2 school teachers in Saskatchewan. He was born in Calgary to a teenage mother who gave him up for adoption. And right out of the gate, he was pretty political in high school. He attended an event with his mother for the Progressive Conservatives and got the political bug. Then he was president of the Conservative club at U of C, where he attended university. So he's always been involved. He right out of university, he did work as a staffer for Stockwell Day, and then eventually become elected in 2004, and has been elected ever since as an MP. He's nicknamed Skippy by former cabinet minister John Baird because he was sort of an attack dog, and he never was scared to be confrontational to anyone in leadership, even right when he was elected, or talk about issues in a different way, regardless of whether that's the way the party was going. So he was kind of always an attack dog, not just to the opposition, but also within caucus. And it's been noted that Harper, who was very heavy-handed, actually didn't mind that. So he was the one who first appointed Pierre to a cabinet minister position. So yeah, I mean, let's just talk about the numbers here in the leadership race, Scott. What were some of the major numbers from the leadership race that stuck out to you? I know a lot of people were disappointed that Leslyn got like a distant third. What does that mean? Let's crunch the numbers and talk about the breakdown.
Sure. Yeah. So I spent the last night translating everything from a PDF to Excel manually, and then double checking all the numbers for all the ridings So it took quite a bit of time. But once you do that, the importance of doing that is it kind of reveals some stories a little bit. So there's no doubt about it that Pierre did very, very well, basically in every single riding right across the country. If he didn't come in first, he came in second in those 8 ridings, like Alissa said, 2 in Ontario and 6 in Quebec. His margins were definitely larger in some areas as opposed to others, especially in Western Canada. His margins were larger than his margins in most places in Ontario, in Quebec, and most definitely in Atlantic Canada, which was a lot more competitive. Lawson also had her areas of strength. She was very competitive in Atlantic Canada. She had lots of votes in Western Canada, far more than someone like Jean Charest. But the problem is that, of course, Pierre had quite a few more. So her percentage of the vote and the points would go down. So, while there was a 7-point margin between Jean Charest's 16% of the points and Lawson Lewis's 9% of the points, there was actually less than a 2,000 vote margin between Charest's 48,000 and Lawson's 46,000 and change. So, an interesting question is, what would have happened if Pierre didn't run in this leadership race and we had all the candidates that did run? What do those numbers look like? And so I did some calculations based on that. I spoke with people who were involved in different campaigns about what's kind of a reasonable redistribution. And so one person said to me, probably about 300,000 people still would have voted in this leadership race, even if Pierre were not in it. A lot of people need to remember that Pierre Poilievre, for the last number of years, like 20 years, ever since he was elected, he's been doing e-petitions on, and physical petitions as well on carbon taxes, on, recently the mandates in the Freedom Convoy, different issues that arise. So he's been building this database for like 20 years. I think someone told me, and I don't know if this number is true or not, but it does seem reasonable to me that at the beginning of the leadership race, especially after all the convoy stuff, he had a database of around 900,000 Canadians. So
Whoa.
A very large database to draw from.
That's crazy.
To compare, right now our organization has only been in existence for just over 5 years. Really have to take 2 of those years out because of the COVID restrictions. And we have a database of 30,000, which is quite impressive, but it kind of highlights the work that we need to do to work toward a much larger database. And there are pro-lifers out there, and we will get them into our database. It's just a function of time. But anyway, so if you assume that 40% of the 295,000 people that voted for Pierre would not have voted in this leadership race, probably because they would not have been members, they were in his database, not accessible really to other candidates. How do you distribute the rest of his vote? Well, I talked to a few other people on the campaigns, and they said from their internal data, when they were keeping track of who the number 2s were for a lot of Pierre number 1s, it would be about 60% for Lawson, just under 40% for Baber, around 2% for Charest, and 1% for Aitchison, which kind of makes sense, right? So if you take out the 40% that wouldn't vote and redistribute the other 60% to the other candidates proportionally, and of course, probably in Quebec, Charest would get a higher percentage than 2%, and then in parts of Western Canada, I'm sure Lawson would have got higher than 60%, so it kind of evens out. The result would have been that on the first ballot, Lawson would have had over 50% of the vote and about 47% of the points. So quite clearly, Lawson would have won that race. So for other pro-lifers and social conservatives out there thinking like, this is super disappointing or whatever, it sounds counterintuitive. It's actually kind of an impressive result given against the juggernaut that Pierre Poilievre has. I mean, Lawson has only been an elected member of parliament for less than a year. Pierre's been there for almost 20. She's been in public life for less than 5 years. Pierre's been in public life for, almost 20. She went out there, got several degrees, started her own business. So she's been out there in the real world, grinding it out. And like the rest of us, she wasn't, elected in the House of Commons for 20 years. So it's kind of like comparing apples to oranges. But that is an interesting little stat that I went through when calculating the numbers, on a reasonable basis and based on some data that I was given. So those are some interesting results right there.
Now, what are some other stats that stuck out to you? Like I did look at the numbers and notice that Scott Aitchison didn't get any points. He got 0 points in 36 ridings, which is pretty crazy.
Yeah, in more than 10% of the ridings, Scott Aitchison, who was particularly nasty, I would say, to Leslyn Lewis during the leadership race, he got 0 votes in over 10% of the ridings in 36 ridings, which means that he got 0 points in those 36 ridings, which is, it's quite embarrassing. It's not embarrassing for someone like Leslyn or even Pierres to get, 700 or 500 or, almost 1,000 votes in a riding where Pierre got, 2,000 votes. Like that, that's not necessarily an embarrassing stat. Like, as a comparison, in 2013, the Liberal Party of Canada had their leadership race after Michael Ignatieff got destroyed in that 2011 election against Harper, where the Liberals went to third place in the House of Commons. And for that election, it was the worst result for the Liberal Party of Canada since Confederation. They had never been either not in opposition or in government. It was the first time they were in neither, and it was the lowest percentage result they ever got. So in the wake of that came... They all kind of put their eggs in one basket, being Justin Trudeau. In that leadership race for the Liberal Party, they changed the party constitution so that if you want to be a voting member in the leadership race, you didn't have to pay, $10, $15, $20. It was free. So they only had 100,000 people vote in that leadership race compared to, over 400,000 for this leadership race where you actually had to pay. And in that leadership race, Justin Trudeau got 80,000. So he got a higher percentage of the vote and he got more points than Pierre Poilievre did, or Pierre Poilievre did in this leadership race. But actually he won 300 out of then 308 ridings. So he had a higher percentage of the ridings than Pierre did in his leadership race. But in terms of raw numbers, he did much, 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 much worse than Pierre in that leadership race, and actually not that much better than Leslyn Lewis or Jean Charest, or even Aaron O'Toole or Peter MacKay in the last leadership race. So it is interesting to kind of look at those numbers. One other thing I will say about Leslyn is that she did increase her vote in well over 2/3 of the ridings compared to her vote last time. And you would have to assume that a good percentage, and I don't know what that percentage would be, I can't surmise, is it 10, is it 20, is it 30, but a percentage of the vote that she would have had in 2020 in that leadership race would have gone to Pierre in this leadership race. So the fact that she increased the number of votes overall across the board, the fact that she increased the number of votes in over 2/3 of the ridings, I think is a pretty good result for Leslyn, especially compared to, who she was running against in this leadership race.
Pretty interesting stuff there, Scott. And this is just the beginning of not only Leslyn's journey into politics, but also the Conservative Party of Canada, what's going to happen with them in the future and in the next election. So when we come back, we will talk to Andrew Lawton more about the breakdown of Pierre's first week. So stay tuned and we'll be right back.
We live in a world that grows through communication.
Every connection comes from a dream to be heard and realized.
To welcome a better future. What are your dreams?
LaRosse Media will help communicate your vision through our professional video production services and marketing strategies.
Start building connections to your future audience. Visit larossemedia.com
and be sure to check out our extended service options.
Dream, produce, market, succeed with LaRosse Media.
Serving Canada from coast to coast to coast.
And we're back, and we're joined today by Andrew Lawton. He is a journalist and columnist. He's been on the show before. He is the author of a new book called The Freedom Convoy. If you haven't heard of it or even bought the book, please go and check it out. Buy it on Amazon. Thank you so much for joining us, Andrew.
Hey, always good to talk to you. Thanks for having me on.
Now let's just get right into it. Talk about this leadership race and the results. First off, with a huge landslide of 68% for Pierre Poilievre. I almost just said Pierre Trudeau. That would have been bad. Did the results surprise you?
Pierre Poutine, Pierre Trudeau, Pierre Poilievre, doesn't matter. I would say the margin was noteworthy. I don't want to say it was a big shock. I think that obviously something that decisive is unique. I mean, not even Stephen Harper, who I think is held up as being one of the more unifying and stable figures in Canadian conservative politics. Even he didn't get 68.15%. But the actual result was not at all surprise. And I don't think that even from that first week of the campaign, anyone is really that surprised by where things went.
Mm-hmm. Now, what do you think this result means for each of the candidates individually, right from Pierre all the way to Scott Aitchison?
Well, I think it means for Pierre Poilievre, it means that his coalition is a lot broader than I think some of his critics and some of the media want to pretend. It isn't just the hard right. It isn't just, one particular part of the so-called Big Blue Tent. He has appealed to a lot of different camps, a lot of different types of conservatives. I think to Scott Aitchison, you know what? He ran the race. He fundraised to keep himself in the race. He put some policies out. I think it sets him up for some level of notoriety or profile in the future. For Roman Baber, I think, again, this was an opportunity to take himself from an Ontario political context onto a national stage. And I think by and large, he did that. The fact that he came in ahead of a sitting MP in the race, Scott Aitchison, is, I think, noteworthy and good on him for that. Jean Charest, I think, for him, it really just, and I don't mean this in a snarky way, but it really just says that he is not in touch with this party. He thought he could sort of come in from the private sector, swoop in and have some success, but he didn't. And it wasn't even close. And, he won just a tiny, tiny number of ridings. I think it was 8 ridings in the whole country, and 6 of those were in Quebec. So we're not talking about a guy that really has much to offer the Conservatives in their current form. Leslyn Lewis, and I saved her for last because I think this is probably the direction that we want to head with this discussion. I think it says to her that she is certainly a player in the Conservative Party and she's a player in conservative politics. But I think it also says that there are a lot of social conservative or pro-life voters that are not single issue voters that like Leslyn Lewis and like her belief on this, but that's not the only thing they care about. And that's why they may align with someone like Pierre Poilievre on other issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was kind of the perfect storm for Pierre because he kind of came in right at that sweet spot of the convoy of the COVID issue, because you don't really have to necessarily do anything as leader because the issue is sort of going away other than like the American border issue. But you also can speak up pretty prominently about it because there was the convoy and there were other leadership candidates doing so also. So you aren't really sticking your neck out on the line per se. So he was able to get a lot of those voters, I think, that would have gone to Leslyn because of that stance. And that's just the way the cookie crumbles. And we're kind of seeing that in Alberta here too. Like, is it going to go the way of Danielle Smith, who's kind of taking the same stance as Pierre on these convoy, freedom issues, anti-COVID restriction issues, or are SoCons going to vote for the social conservative candidate? So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out and if there's a reflection here provincially as well. Now, you talked about Pierre being a united person who has, what the other leadership candidates say about his actual leadership. And I want to ask you about his leadership team, because do you think that spells out united conservative, if you will? Do you think that there are different types of conservatives on this leadership team? Or do you think, what are your general thoughts about his new leadership team?
Well, there are certainly different types. The question is, has he done an amazing job at including every major bloc in the Conservative Party in that team? And I don't know the answer to that. I think we'll have to hold out to see what his shadow cabinet looks like. Remember, in 2017, Andrew Scheer, I think, had a cabinet or a shadow cabinet spot for every single one of his competitors who had a seat in Parliament, except for Deepak O'Brien, who had turned it down. So I do think that there was a show of unity there that was very very important. And I don't know if we're going to see that there. We do know in 2020 that Erin O'Toole just shoved Leslyn Lewis, despite her being instrumental in his victory, just like to the back. I think she was basically in the parking lot, not even like she was like the back of the back of the back of the back bench. She was pretty much in Gatineau. And I think that was a big red flag. And I think a lot of people did note that early on, but then by the time the election comes around, you know, it is what it is. So I guess the question is that we all have to look basically at where we're going to see Pierre Poilievre move as far as his actions are concerned. He has in his deputy leaders two very loyal supporters of his, Melissa Lantsman and Tim Uppal. I'm not really convinced either one is a social conservative. I don't know that much about Tim's position on this, but he also has Andrew Scheer in a very prominent role, which I think is good because Andrew Scheer does speak to social conservatives, and he has some people that are a bit more wonky libertarian types in there. So I think it is something that has a level of diversity. The question is going to be what happens to those people, though, because you can put someone in a token role, but if that's the extent of it, it doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah, in terms of the House leadership team, which Alissa was alluding to there, so for those of you that don't know, that Pierre Poilievre and Pierre Poilievre, Pierre Poilievre, he like other leaders in the House of Commons and then of course in the provincial legislative assemblies put together what's called a House team. So this team is kind of responsible for the direction of the party that the leader would like to see within the House of Commons or the legislative assembly. So it's one of the first acts that a leader does, and he did it earlier this week. And it's kind of a nice segue into you know, what we think where the party's going under Pierre and what we think of his first week. But before we get to that, I just kind of want to come back to the results a little bit because you know, there in some ways there isn't a whole lot to delve into the results. I mean, he won 330 out of 338 ridings quite handedly in the vast majority of them. But I guess like Andrew, like because this is a pro-life social conservative podcast, what do you think that those results mean for pro-lifers? Because on the face of it, if you look at it, you're like, well, you know, pro-lifers, social conservatives, if you see Leslyn Lewis being the personification of those of us that have those views and values, you know, we only got, you know, 9% of the points, 11% of the vote. Do you think that's a fair assessment? Or do you think that there is a sizable chunk that voted for Pierre? And if there is a sizable chunk, like, how big or how small do you think that chunk is? Basically, what should pro-lifers and social conservatives discern out of these results from the leadership race, especially as opposed to the previous two leadership races within the Conservative Party of Canada?
I think that's a really important question. And I'm glad we are actually spending at least a few moments on this, because I started earlier by talking about the fact that not every voter is a single issue voter. And, you know, I'm connected to the firearms community, and there are gun owners who are single issue voters. I mean, they won't vote for a conservative that isn't a strong advocate for gun rights. And conversely, if there were a liberal that were to come along and be a strong advocate, they might actually vote liberal. And I think there are a lot of people who are pro-life that are in that boat as well, where that is the only issue they care about at the polls. And that is, I think, an entirely legitimate and defensible position. So I'm not at all knocking that. But I think that there are a lot of people that are pro-life and they're strongly pro-life, but they also care about other things. And there are people that might be more softly pro-life, where they have beliefs on it, but it's not the thing that gets them up and gets them to vote for a candidate or volunteer for a candidate, but they still care about that and they still value that. And when push comes to shove, they would still prefer a candidate who is pro-life over one who's not. So I don't take from the results that Leslyn Lewis comes in with 9% of the points as being a knock against the place that pro-lifers have in conservative politics in Canada in the least. I think, and Alissa mentioned this earlier, something we really need to realize is that government was on the front doorstep of people of faith in a very real and a very awful way over the last 2 years through lockdowns and through restrictions. And I think that for a lot of people, abortion, which is a real issue, is a little bit more abstract than, wow, it's illegal for me to have a church service right now. Or my pastor ended up in jail because he had a church service. He had the temerity to open the doors of the church. And I don't mean that abortion's not a real issue that people care about. I'm pro-life and I'm passionate about that issue. But I think that the libertarian who's not pro-life, who says absolutely your religious freedom should be uninfringed is more compelling in a pandemic environment to a lot of voters, because that's where they saw for the last 2.5 years the real threat. And Danielle Smith in Alberta, Alissa, is a great example of this. Here's a woman who has said multiple times over she is not a social conservative. She's not pro-life. She's completely fine with gay marriage. She's a big fan of Caitlyn Jenner. Okay, that's fine. But her caveat to that is, but I wouldn't dare put a pastor in jail. And for a lot of people, that is, I think, a pretty strong pitch right now when the so-called social conservatives like Jason Kenney have overseen governments that have done that. So I think that's the Pierre Poilievre effect, too. A lot of these people that were part of that convoy demographic, if you want to call it that, were saying, you know what, maybe he's not in line with me on these issues, but I believe he's not going to shut me down or lock me down or arrest my pastor.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask a follow-up question on that, both to you, Andrew, and to Alissa as well, because I think this is a little bit interesting. And as you're speaking there, Andrew, kind of brought this up in me. So obviously, and Alissa can attest to this because she's on the ground there in Alberta, Danielle Smith is bringing a lot of people who would identify the pro-life issue high on their list of priorities, other social conservative issues as well. And like you said, Andrew, but right now in this very moment, in the wake of all the restrictions that were lifted, months ago, but, only months ago, it might be a little bit lower than it normally is. So if Danielle Smith is bringing a lot of these people into her voting coalition for the leadership race, and Pierre Poilievre did the same as well at the federal level, do you think that there's a little bit of danger, I suppose, for those two leadership teams? I mean, Pierre has already won. Danielle, it's not a foregone conclusion, kind of like it was for Pierre, that she's going to win, but she definitely is one of the front runners, if not the front runner. Do you think it's a danger that they'll look at their leadership results and say, well, I don't stand for this issue or that issue or whatever issue that a lot of these people hold, but as time goes on and as that issue fades away, which we kind of saw a little bit affect the Roman Baber campaign, do you think there's a bit of a danger of that if they ignore their number two issue, whether it be abortion, or their number two issue maybe provincially would be, trans ideology within the education system, that voter coalition could fray maybe a little bit sooner than it normally would?
I think there's a real risk of that. I mean, Pierre Poilievre didn't even have, the Leslyn Lewis campaign can't even look to Pierre Poilievre and say, you're only there because of me, like they could with Aaron O'Toole. Right. Or, the Pierre Lemieux, Brad Trost factor in 2017 with Andrew Scheer. That we don't have that dynamic because it's a first ballot victory. So I think in general, when you win so decisively, the incentive to cooperate with your opponents is way, way, way down. I mean, some would argue that he has no interest in cooperating with the more moderate wing of the party who supported Jean Charest either. But I think that's wrong. I think leadership, especially of the Conservative Party of Canada, involves a coalition and having to keep different groups together. But I also wonder if there's a strategic aspect here that needs to be considered. And this may be a contentious point for you two and for your audience, but I wonder if the easier path to electing pro-life candidates is not having a pro-life leader. And the reason I say that is because when you have a pro-life leader, that becomes the issue of the campaign. That becomes the thing the media pounces on. Whereas if you just focus on, the nominations and getting all the pro-life members elected, which right now does a tremendous job doing, then at a certain point, the leader is beholden to their caucus in a very real way. And I think we saw some of that near the end of, and ultimately leading to the end of, Aaron O'Toole's tenure.
Yeah, I definitely would not disagree with that. I think that it does overshadow a lot of things when it comes to a politician, a leader. And you see that with Andrew Scheer. And if you did have someone good like Leslyn Lewis or Daddy DeSantis, or someone who's able to actually respond well to this issue, it would be a different story. But if you have someone who's stuttering, who doesn't know what to say, who's kind of capitulating, it's horrible. It's horrible for pro-lifers and social conservatives. It's horrible for small C conservatives or big C. It's horrible for everyone. It doesn't help anyone except Trudeau, to be honest, and the Liberals. So if you're a pro-life leader, you have to be someone like Leslyn Lewis, which is why we were so hard for her, or else it's almost better that you just talk about other issues, because you're doing more of a disservice to this issue, in my opinion. On the other note, with regards to what Scott said, I absolutely do believe that it will spark a lot of controversy within the parties. It will be interesting to see where these leaders go. So will Pierre be more of a Erin O'Toole when it comes to social issues? Because we know that they're going to come up. They came up already with sex-selective abortion, with conversion therapy. People are willing to overlook those things with regards to Pierre because of the COVID issue. But going forward, when there is no COVID issue, are they going to be more willing to overlook that stuff? Like, one could arguably say the conversion therapy issue was one that was Erin O'Toole's downfall, or one of the few things that were Erin O'Toole's downfall. With regards to Alberta, even more so. I think people are very passionate about school choice, about conscience rights, about things that Danielle Smith has backtracked on. So they may vote for her during the leadership race because of these COVID issues, but then when these issues actually are confronted to them, it's going to be there's going to be a big backlash. So, but it just depends how they deal with it. So, hopefully, social conservatives can, like you said, Andrew, increase their influence by increasing the caucus and increasing that way, instead of just kind of saying, "Oh, we're the kingmakers, listen to us," because that doesn't super work that well either. So we'll see. We'll have to go from there and just work together, hopefully, on these issues so that they're dealt with in a proper way. So, I mean, you've interviewed Pierre. We haven't. We just, as a millennial woman who's also married, who has kids, Pierre does not speak to me really. Like, I'm a cultural conservative, a small c conservative. I care about inflation, but I mean, I know it will go up, it'll go down. Like, there's a lot of different elements. I don't think Pierre is the savior to inflation in any way. So that economic discussion doesn't really speak to me. It does a little bit to my husband more so, but not to me. He doesn't address anything cultural whatsoever. He didn't in his caucus speech or in his victory speech. So what do you think are his greatest strengths and his weaknesses as a leader?
I think his ability to communicate is certainly a strength. I mean, getting people to care about inflation, as you've just indicated, is not a given. And I think he has talked about it in a way that a lot of people, not necessarily the Alissa demographic, but a lot of people are paying attention to it and do care about it. And I think you're right, though, that that's not enough. And this is a discussion that we've had. It's certainly a discussion Scott and I have had offline, that the Conservatives have to offer more than just, slightly better bookkeeping skills to distinguish themselves from the Liberals and from the NDP. But I think that when you are talking about a cost of living crisis, there is an opportunity for a Conservative to come in who can talk about this in a way that matters to people. But I also think that a big part of what he needs to do is not let up on the things that he's talked about during the leadership that are not the items that typically end up in a Conservative platform. I mean, free speech is a big one, and it's one that matters a lot. And he sort of talked about it a little early on and then moved on from it. Defunding the CBC, probably not most people's single issue, but it is a significant one for Conservatives in this country. And if you could sell that to people, then I think there is a good opportunity for you to build a coalition beyond that. As far as weaknesses, I think one of the biggest weaknesses that Pierre Poilievre has is probably going to be the people around him, is that he has a lot of the establishment political consultants behind him, people that have worked on campaigns going back to Stephen Harper's. And the default position in Conservative politics is to cower, is to cut and run. And even if it looks like he's not done that up to this point, the fear is that he's surrounded by the same people that play from the same playbook Conservatives have always played from.
Now, do you actually see that happening within the last 48 hours? Because with the Alan Reyes situation, he sat as an independent. Then they sent out a text message telling the people of his riding to urge him to resign. And then the Conservative Party sent out an apology for that text. So do you already see sort of this clash between what Pierre wants to do in terms of being on the offensive and what the party wants to do and just apologizing and being more on the defensive?
Yeah, I'm very curious about who said go on that one, because if that was Pierre Poilievre's first order of business to come in and say, hey guys, let's really sink this Reyes fellow, that's a big problem. If this was just some really, really eager, like, conservative intern in CRG in Ottawa, then there is a big problem there. So I think this was a bad move all around. I mean, Alan Reyes left the party in a way that was as graceful as it can be. He did it early on. He didn't take a flamethrower to it. He just left, and that was that. So I really hope this didn't have Pierre's fingerprints on it, because if so, that would set off his time in office as in a very negative way.
Well, let me ask you about this, not about that issue specifically, but, Pierre won the leadership, and that was verified on Saturday evening. You were covering it that evening. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to be up there in Ottawa. It was my daughter's first birthday, so we were down here in Stony Creek. Missed the awesome football game where Winnipeg just destroyed Saskatchewan 54-20 in the Banjo Bowl. So there's a lot of stuff I was willing to sacrifice for my daughter's first birthday. You always got to sneak that in, don't you? Yeah, well, I mean, they're 12-1. It's insane. But anyway, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, it's actually been quite a busy week for a new leader of a political party, especially when, the House or your legislature isn't sitting. We've had a couple of speeches from Pierre, like Alissa alluded to, his acceptance speech on Saturday evening, his first speech to caucus, because the Conservatives had their national caucus in Ottawa earlier this week. He's had some interactions with the media, which, there's quite a story around there. And then, of course, dealing with now former members of caucus. So I suppose, Andrew, you're a member of the media, and, this is obviously something you cover, and, how politicians are doing in terms of their communications, and, what do you kind of make of his first week? And I just want to put a caveat on there for everyone. Like, you can't judge a leader's entire tenure as a leader based off the first week, right? Whether we think, it was a good week or a bad week or a middling week. But I'm curious, kind of, what are your first impressions, I suppose, as Pierre, as leader of the Conservative Party of Canada thus far?
Well, I want to talk about the media aspect of this first and foremost, because Pierre Poilievre has made a very concerted effort to avoid media, specifically avoid mainstream media. The number of interviews he did throughout the course of the leadership campaign, very, very small. I had him on my show a couple of times. He did some other independent media interviews. I don't think he did, and you might be able to correct me on this, I don't think he did a single post-debate scrum at any of the debates. The official party debates, the Canada Strong and Free debate, he actually ignored or rejected, and they didn't ignore, they said no, the Independent Press Gallery debate, and then also the Western Standard debate. So even among sort of friendlier independent media, he wasn't always front and center on there. So he's done a front runner campaign, which is that I don't want to be punched the punching bag. Okay, that's the decision. But it also means that the mainstream media over the last 7 months, 9 months hasn't really felt like they've ever been able to get their pound of flesh off of him, because he comes out, he stays the front runner until the very end, he wins with 68%, and the media has never really gotten to go at him. So this first event that he does as leader, where he's coming out and will not take questions, the media gets very annoyed about that. And they just then start to, in David Aiken's case, just shout at him before he even starts talking, demanding he takes questions. And eventually he takes 2 questions at the end of it. But I think it's a big mistake. And I'll say this for 2 reasons. Number one, if you are the guy that is the communicator and that's your pitch and that's your selling point, then you shouldn't be afraid of communicating. You shouldn't be afraid of the media. It's one thing to go on offense. It's one thing to flip the script and do what he did with David Aiken. It's another thing to say, I'm not even going to open up the door to these questions. And I think that's a big tactical problem that I would say that the team needs to reevaluate. Again, if your issue is that you want to expose media bias, great. Let them ask the question and then expose it from there.
I think this one event that occurred the other day has just so many layers to it, right? And it exposes some things on both sides, both on for the leader himself, the leadership team, as well as a lot of members of legacy media, because of course it's only the Parliamentary Press Gallery that was there. So for those of you who maybe aren't so familiar with the town of Ottawa, Pierre Poilievre called a press conference in front of the doors of the House of Commons, which currently is located in West Block. So that's not an uncommon place for people to do scrums, especially right before they go into question period or coming out of question period.
I don't think you can call it a press conference, though.
Well, but this is the thing, and you're going exactly to my point, because conference means that you're conferring, which means there's two-way communication, right? So that if you're calling media to come cover something, the traditional idea is that the media is going to ask questions about the thing that you wanted to talk about and maybe some other issues, which is very normal. And sometimes, and correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, but sometimes, leaders of different political parties might have a very busy schedule. So they'll have a press conference about an issue that is something that they would like to talk about, to put out into the media. And they might only take, let's say, 2 questions or 4 questions, right? Typically, that's the minimum. 2 in English, 2 in French. I think toward the end of Harper's time as prime minister, they were taking 5 questions, and they left it up to the press gallery to kind of determine who was going to ask what. Or sometimes they would have, I believe the prime minister does this now, and Aaron O'Toole, I believe, did this during the election campaign, which is, okay, I'm done making my announcement. We'll now have 20 minutes of Q&A. It could be 5 questions, could be 10 questions, depends how long the questions are, how long the answers are. But it's my understanding, because I texted a couple of contacts that we have, acquaintances that I have, who are members of the legacy media, who are members of the parliamentary press gallery, who were there because I saw them on camera. And I said, is it true that the press secretary for Pierre came up to you guys like basically seconds before Pierre came out and said that there'd be no questions? And she said, yeah. And then, David Aiken then acted like a buffoon, and I'm not going to excuse David's behavior. And sure, I think Pierre took that interaction with David and turned it into a fundraising email, and perhaps won the battle. But I think my concern would be, if I were on Pierre's team, that you might be losing the war a little bit on this, because even the parliamentary reporter for the Western Standard tweeted out and confirmed that, yeah, there were no questions going to be asked, and this is not something that's typical. And the thing that he wanted to talk about, which I don't actually know if it's what he wanted to talk about, or if he just wanted to try and instigate some sort of reaction from someone like David Aiken, was his response to Justin Trudeau's inflation fighting plan, which is actually quite inflationary. And sure, like that's something that's worthy of talking about, especially since that's what he wants to focus on.
Wait, he wanted to talk about inflation?
Yeah, I know, crazy, right?
Just
Absolutely.
inflation.
Yeah, just inflation, as some people are calling it. But anyway, there are so many layers to it, and I just find it very interesting. I'm not saying this is at all indicative, and there's going to be a transition team. So some people that are on his leadership team now aren't going to be, in his office of leader of the opposition, aren't going to be, in party headquarters. So maybe it'd be a little more professionalized. I don't know if that's the right word, but yeah, Alissa, I don't know if you have a take on that or not.
I'll also point out that it wasn't just the legacy media or media in general that he was shutting out. He also took no questions at his events. And if you went to any other leadership candidates' events, most of the time it was questions. But Pierre, he just did his shtick. He took pictures and he pieced out. So he didn't want to answer questions in general. We can talk about why you alluded to it, and I think that's correct, that he would have been the punching bag, and he did do this leadership race outside of that. But I think now that he actually is the leader and he's the attack dog, he was Harper's attack dog, he holds Trudeau accountable, he's the only one who can beat Trudeau. How can you do that if you're never taking questions or answering questions? You can't just be like that in question period. You have to do it outside of that, the halls of the House of Commons as well.
One thing that you mentioned, Andrew, and I think this is kind of a shame how everything has kind of gone down this week, is that you are right, and I don't think anyone would disagree, that Pierre is an excellent communicator, especially on the things that he really cares about and wants to talk about, which I think would go for everyone, right? He has this persona, rightfully or wrongfully, that he's willing to take on, Justin Trudeau and the Liberals, and he's willing to take on the quote unquote liberal media, and he's not scared of the issues. And then when you're not willing to take questions and you're finally badgered into a corner, again, not proper behavior by David, and then you finally say, okay, well, then we'll take 2 questions, and you kind of make it up. It's when we're talking about his strengths and weaknesses, like that's a huge strength that he has that we would all concede, and it's not really being utilized. And I think a lot of people are kind of excited to see him get into these back and forths with the media. And I don't quite understand why he doesn't want to do that, because I think that is a good strength. And I think very few people can pull that off. But anyway, those are just some of my thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think you're right. And look, it's one thing to call out the media and call out the hostility. It's another thing to not actually give them the opportunity to show that to people. If that's your strategy, to expose and undermine the media, well, you have to actually let them do what David Aiken did, quite frankly, which you're going to get when they're allowed to speak. But I also think that there is a big part of this that is likely weighing on what they're doing, which is that he's talked about a lot of things that he knows he can't talk about between now and the general election. And I suspect defunding the CBC is one of those things. But I think it's important to figure out, the word of the day is always pivot after leadership. It's important to figure out, okay, how are we going to transition from leadership mode to general election mode? And the hope will be for someone like me that this is that you're only transitioning on style. You're not transitioning on substance. We saw Aaron O'Toole transition on pretty much everything. In fact, the fact that he hadn't even transitioned his gender by the time of the election was a surprise.
I was wondering if you're going to go there, and then you did, and I'm glad you did, because if you didn't, Alissa was going to. So
let me just say about Aaron O'Toole though, because I was on the O'Toole campaign team as a journalist, not on the team itself, but on the plane covering it as a journalist for about a week during the election. And by the end of that week, actually, I think by the beginning of the week, the media hated him. And it wasn't that they hated him because they were biased liberals and he was a conservative. They hated him because he was unable to answer the most basic, fundamental of question. And that bothered them. And it bothers them when Trudeau does it too, believe it or not. And it bothered me because I was asking at one point, I just needed the clip. I was asking a question that was right out of the platform that should have been just a, yes, I'm doing that. And instead, at the end of it, I was like, I don't know if he knows what's in the platform, or I don't know if he's just so programmed to not answer the question that even when he gets a slam dunk, he's just running it through all of these filters and in calculations. And that was the big problem that a lot of people had with him. So I think the O'Toole strategy, just if you want to call it that, didn't work. And I think that Pierre Poilievre needs to be able to rise to the challenge here. He needs to be able to address it head on.
And I think he, in particular, individually, is very capable of doing that should he want to, right? He's been training for this basically his entire adult life for the past 20 years during his time in elected public office. When you're talking about the pivot, and Alissa, I think, alluded to this as well earlier in our conversation, is you do see a pivot already happening, which is to be kind of expected. It's obviously not the same as what Aaron O'Toole did, at least not yet, and I hope that won't be the case, where you have a complete 180. Granted, you have to adopt various policy positions during your leadership race to have a 180, and that's something that Pierre didn't do, and purposefully so. But he did adopt a few policy positions. You talked about defunding the CBC. He did talk about how with the World Economic Forum not allowing, members of caucus, members of his cabinet being able to go. And to his credit, he did spoke quite strongly against Bill C-11, the internet bill, censorship bill. And I'll just note this. I remember on Saturday evening, a bunch of people texting me, well, not a bunch, a few people texting me saying, did you see, Pierre's great speech or whatever? And I said, well, no, it's my daughter's birthday, but I'll review the speech maybe Saturday evening or Monday morning. So Monday morning, this is what I did. And I kind of very well delivered, probably one of the best well-delivered speeches of any leader of the opposition, probably for several decades. I will grant that, 11 days out of 10. But when I was listening to the content of it, I was thinking, well, this sounds very much like a speech that Andrew Scheer would have given, or Aaron O'Toole, actually more so like Aaron O'Toole. And what I noted for it, and what the Power and Politics panel on CBC, including two former Liberal Party strategists and a former NDP Quebec MP, all noted, was how all those things were dropped and how moderate it was and how great it was to hear it, all the stuff. So the pivot seems to be on. It might be, a little more subtle than it was with Aaron O'Toole, but I agree with you, Andrew. There are certain positions that he adopted during the leadership race that I hope that he maintains. I think that's the expectation from a lot of people, frankly. And it'll be interesting to see going forward, especially once this transition team is done and he has his full permanent team in place, if that's what they choose to do or not.
Well, it's certainly an interesting time for the Conservative Party, for Pierre, for Leslin, for Baber, not really for Aitchison, but we'll see what happens in the future. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for coming on. We'll let you go, and we always value your input. Make sure you check out Andrew. He has his Substack, Andrew Lawton, also on Twitter and Facebook. Just basically Google Andrew Lawton, and you'll be able to find him. Please go check that out. Andrew will also be speaking at the Manning Networking Conference, or the Canadian Strong and Free Conference in Red Deer on September 24th. So if you're in Alberta, please check him out there. There'll also be all the UCP leadership candidates speaking, as well as one of Jason Kenney's final speeches as well. But yeah, Andrew also is a journalist and a columnist at True North Center. He's a good friend to us. So thanks again for coming on. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you.
We're so grateful to Scott for saying Poilievre's name right this podcast.
Or at least try to. A for effort.
Absolutely. So make sure you check us out. You subscribe to our podcast on Google Podcasts, on Spotify, on Rumble, on YouTube, basically anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can also follow us on Twitter at RightNowHQ for some hot takes and daily updates. And we have a new episode of the podcast every Friday. And so we'll talk to you next week. Thanks for joining us.
Bye for now.
Nature communicates with us in a universal language. The sunrise starts a new day. The sunset marks our accomplishments.
The most beautiful communication is where the speaker and the listener match perfectly and understand the same message.
Your future audience is waiting to hear from you. What message do you need to share?
At LaRosse Media, we fashion beautiful communications through our professional video production services and marketing strategies.
Create your own most beautiful message. Visit larosmedia.com and be sure to check out our extended service options.
Dream, produce, market, succeed with LaRosse Media.
Serving Canada from coast to coast to coast.